Hello, my name is Mario Peters. I'm a research fellow at the German Historical Institute, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Institute and our Pacific Regional Office at the University of California, Berkeley, I would like to welcome all of you to the third session of our four-part lecture series, Mobilities and Migration Across the Americas. Today, we will hear from Dr. Andra Chaston and Dr. Danzonino Singh about their research on public transport and transatlantic scientific exchanges. Professor Bianca Medeiros has kindly accepted our invitation to take part in the session as a moderator. I will introduce all our speakers to you shortly. But first, I turn over to my colleague, Albert, to say a few words.
Thank you, Mario. My name is Albert Manke, and I'm a research fellow at the Pacific Regional Office of the German Historical Institute Washington, based at the University of California in Berkeley. We would like to thank the sponsors of our lecture series at UC Berkeley, which are the Institute of European Studies, the Center for Latin American Studies, and Global, International, and Area Studies. Our thanks also go to our international partners, the Marian Center for Advanced Latin American Studies, CALAS, based at the University of Guadalajara, the Marian Center Conviviality, Inequality in Latin America, or MESILA, based at the University of Sao Paulo, and the International Research Training Group, Temporalities of Future at the Free University in Berlin.
Thank you, Albert. Setting the focus in inter-American entanglements and disentanglements, connections and ruptures, our series addresses two major strands. In the previous two sessions, we had great discussions on the history of human mobility, including migration regimes and transnational governance. Today's session leads us to the second strand, the history of mobility in the sphere of transportation, planning and infrastructure. Over the past decade, researchers across the Americas have been combining local, transregional, and transnational approaches to these topics in very creative ways. And we are very happy that today we have three scholars with us who have made important contributions to this strand. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Andra Chaston. She's an assistant professor of history at Washington State University Vancouver and holds a PhD in Latin American history from Yale University. Her research and teaching interests include urban and environmental history, the history of science and technology, the transnational history of aid and development, and the global Cold War. Currently, Dr. Chaston is finishing her book about the history of the metro system in Santiago de Chile, where French-Chilean collaboration played an important role. Dr. Chaston has conducted research for this project in Chile, France, Brazil, Mexico, and the United States, and her work has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the PEO Foundation, and the Conference on Latin American History. Dr. Danzonino Singh is an associate researcher at the Argentine National Scientific and Technical Research Council, and a researcher and lecturer at the Center for Intellectual History at the National University of Quilmes. He holds a PhD in history from the University of London and is the co-editor of the book Términos Clave para los Estudios de Movilidad en América Latina, which came out in 2018. Dr. Singh has served as an executive committee member of the International and Interdisciplinary Research Association T2M, Transport, Traffic and Mobility. And in 2016, he received a research grant from the Fulbright Foundation for the project we will hear about today on the cultural and transnational histories of the subways in Boston and Buenos Aires. Last but not least, I'm very happy to introduce to you Bianca Medeiros. She's professor of sociology at the University of Sao Paulo and researcher at the Center for Metropolitan Studies, where she coordinates the research group Mobilities, Theories, Themes, and Methods. Her current research interests include the photographic and cinematic representation of urban spaces and cultural otherness, transnational mobilities in the spheres of tourism and migration, and urban inequality and its interface with consumption and leisure practices. Among her recent publications is the book Urban Latin America, Images, Words, Flows, and the Built Environment, which she co-edited in 2018. Professor Freiden Medeiros was a visiting researcher at the Center for Migration and Development at Princeton University and the Center for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University. And she was a visiting professor at the University of Texas at Austin, El Colegio de Mexico, and the Graduate Institute of International Studies and Development in Geneva. Welcome to all our speakers. We are very happy to have you with us, and I'm looking very forward to learning more about your research. Just one brief note, to make this event more conversational, we have agreed to integrate the presentations with a group interview format. This means that during the next 45 minutes, Professor Freiden Medeiros will address a few questions to Dr. Chastain and Dr. Singh, who will talk about their research based on these questions. Audience members are welcome to enter their questions into the Q&A section, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. Please keep your questions short and to the point. You can start posting your questions during the event, and in the last part, we will read them out to our speakers. Now I will leave it at that and turn over to Bianca Freire Medeiros to start the conversation. Bianca, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mario, for these kind words and to inviting me. And I also thank the German Historical Institute for the opportunity to share this afternoon, for me at least, Brazilian time, with Dan and Andra, and whose work I admire highly. So, okay, it's a true pleasure. Maybe we could start with the first image. So Dan and Andra, the two of you have been producing cutting edge historical research with a mobile view that complicates simplified conceptualizations of transportation systems. Embracing mobility as a discursive formation, you refuse to treat transport as an empirical fact that exists apart from cultural meanings. In this sense, I believe that a good way to start this conversation is asking you to help us navigate these images in terms of the broader cultural and urban context in which the subway systems were implemented, in which the metro became meaningful as a system of connection. The fact that the two sceneries captured in the photos are so similar in terms of the built environment that they depict invites us to reflect upon broader imaginaries vis-a-vis particular political context, social spatial differences, and cultural convergences that mark the experience of cities such as Boston, Buenos Aires, and Santiago de Chile, which share the historical legacy of colonialism. A second point that emerges from putting the two photos side by side with a map that shows the lines of Santiago Metro, which was built in the second half of the 20th century, is the importance of including a temporal frame in our analysis. Dan demonstrates that planners at the turn of the century associated metros to modernization and progress, while the popular perception was based on ambivalent sentiments, associating the metro at the same time with progress and atavistic imaginaries with death, penas, and inferno. So what are the similarities and contrasts between the fin de siècle experience of Buenos Aires and Boston and the Cold War Santiago in terms of the cultural debates and social anxieties that emerged around the subway system? Could the two of you elaborate on this and on how this changed over the decades in if such perceptions were shared, for instance, by Santiago's inhabitants in the 1960s and 70s? So yeah, this is it.
Do you want to go first, Don?
Yeah, in terms of historical periods. First of all, thank you very much, Mario, for this invitation. I'm glad to share this time with Bianca and Andra, two friends, apart from colleagues, are very close friends, and we share ideas all the time about mobilities. So there are many questions here, Bianca. I will start from the end, which is close to what Andra can help to clarify better. But in my research, I look at first the early period of implementation of underground in the world, including Buenos Aires in this first period. And then, of course, if you look at the Latin American metros, you will find that there is a second period between the 60s and the 70s and 80s, where many cities, apart from Santiago de Chile, included the underground. I'm looking at those metros too today, and I can see very important difference and similarities in between those periods. Congestion is the main problem for everyone, and the underground mainly is a solution for congestion, but also is a contribution to have rapid, like the Americans said, rapid transit, mass transit, to connect a lot of people, masses of people between the city center and the suburbs and the peripheries. But the main, I guess, the main problem or the main mode of transport that it is in dialogue with the underground in the early periods is the tramway. The problem of the street, as you can see in the picture of Boston and Buenos Aires, is the tramway. But in the 50s and the 60s is the buses and the car. And there is a new element that I see, and maybe Andra can tell us more about that, is the environmental question. Contamination, pollution became an important question for Mexico and for Chile, for instance. But for all the American cities, Latin American cities, the problem is the car. And about the second question you asked, another point, which is the culture of the city, the imaginary of the city. The underground, still today, for new undergrounds, for instance, in New Delhi, new undergrounds in Lima, or metro systems still in Bogota as a project, they always give this kind of a status to the city as a modern city, modern metropolis. It's the idea that you enter into the global modernization, let's say, and that can find us in the discourses of Boston people and Buenos Aires people in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but also you can find it in Rio de Janeiro. There is an amazing picture I cannot share you today, but which is now we are a modern metropolis because we have the underground. We have the first subway in the 1970s. I think it's this kind of artifact we have to have in mind that they are the most expensive infrastructure in the city, apart from sanitary works or the city port, right? The underground is more expensive than elevated buses, metro bus, whatever you think about. So it requires a lot of money and it involves an important spatial or material transformation of the city. You have to dig a tunnel. You have to destroy the city and rebuild the city. So this important transformation is what David Harvey called like the impact that the Haussmann reform had in Paris. The idea that you can see materially modernity in the process of modernization, in the destruction, the creative destruction of the city, as Harvey said. You have creative destruction. And this is for me a very interesting thing and something that mostly people who work on transport history don't see that much, which is the process of construction. And I will talk here about the process of construction, not the planning, not the debates only, and not only the experience of the use, but the process of construction to destroy the city, to build up a new infrastructure. So I quit here so Andra can keep talking.
Thank you. Thank you for those really interesting comments, Don. And also more broadly, thank you so much to the German Historical Institute for this opportunity and to Bianca for your very insightful questions and to Mario for all of your organizing efforts. So I had some thoughts about the context, but I'm going to kind of pick out the ones that I think are most interesting, kind of drawing on the questions and also what Don said. So the Santiago Metro was planned and built in the mid to late 60s. And as Don mentioned, a lot of the justifications for it came from the idea of congestion, because cars and buses were multiplying rapidly, and the changes to the city, to the sort of city grid, didn't keep up. So there was just not enough space for the growing number of people. But also at a kind of foundational level, the city was growing rapidly. Santiago grew very rapidly in the early 20th century, but then it grew even faster in the 1950s and 1960s. So it reached, for example, 1 million by the early 1940s, about 2 million by the early 60s, 3 million by the early 1970s. And I try to, in my research, kind of also remember that the transportation crisis was happening at the same time as what was perceived as a more general urban crisis, and especially around the lack of housing. So there was a lot of rural to urban migration, and the housing shortages were really severe. So I try not to forget that, because sometimes transportation planners, my actors that I'm studying, don't really talk about the problem of poblaciones, of squatter settlements, but that was a really big issue in Santiago in the 1960s. Santiago was also very much socially divided by class, and I wanted to show this image, this map, because to kind of give you an idea of where people live, different social classes. Traditionally, the city center was the center of power, but increasingly families with means began to move to the eastern part of Santiago, which was known as the Barrio Alto, which was kind of towards the Andes foothills. And the north, south, and west part of Santiago was kind of mixed, so middle class and working class, and also sort of these so-called marginal settlements along, for example, the banks of the Mapocho River, the foothills of the hills in the north, near the Ring Railroad, sort of an earlier infrastructure project that then drew, it was a source of low-wage income, of employment. So the metro, interestingly, planners argued for a long time, or planners showed that the transit demand was highest north to south, because those were the corridors that didn't have as much kind of infrastructure. The roads were narrower. There were more physical barriers with the Mapocho River and the hills to the north. But in the 60s, planners decided to build the east-west corridor first, and what I found is that this was because the metro was justified as a tool to alleviate car congestion in the east, more than to serve kind of working class users who relied on the bus system. And kind of getting at what Dan was also mentioning, it was seen as a trilogy, a three-part sort of solution to the transportation crisis. One was the metro, two was vialidad, so kind of urban roads and expressways, and the third was transporte urbano, so other forms of transit, especially buses. And those all had to work together. But in practice, the metro was built and vialidad, roads were built, but the part about buses was often sort of just forgotten about until much later, until much more recently, with a big reform in 2007. And I also want to mention that there were also a lot of bodily metaphors. Speaking of cultural representation, this idea that the city would get paralyzed, that the metro was the backbone of the city, sort of circulation depended on the metro. And if this crisis wasn't solved, that the city would kind of asphyxiate, be paralyzed, would not be able to live anymore. So I'll leave it at that. And I just want to mention that this map too is for the 1969 to 1989 period. So a lot of the metro has been, it's been expanded a lot in recent years, but this was a pretty limited system for those 2 decades. It was envisioned to be much larger, but because of the neoliberal reforms in the 1970s during the Pinochet dictatorship, the metro funding was severely cut. I don't want to go on for too much longer, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I have a second question. And so if transport has long been associated with the circulation of people, goods, and other materialities within and across territories, the two of you show that there is much more to it. You unpack how image, knowledge, and technologies also take part on those flows, analyzing how strategic transport infrastructures, such as the metro system, are shaped by patterns of power and identities while creating new ones, traveling in different directions at the same time, disturbing previous definitions of center and periphery. In this sense, it seems to me that a crucial point to your argument is the idea of the metro as a hybrid system that was produced at the same time by a network of human and non-human agents and was unconceivable without the transnational circulation of knowledge and cooperation among experts. So based on your particular empirical cases, I wonder if you could elaborate on the importance of examining not only the politics of mobility, but equally the mobilities of policy and their impact on what Andra calls the geopolitical urbanism. So in other words, how, what, when, and under which circumstances policies travel, and the effects of this movement to the cases that you investigate.
Yeah, the geopolitics and the sort of mobilities of policy. And I'll say a little bit about kind of the collaboration and then also the context under which the collaboration emerged between Chile and France. I think one of my arguments is that the 60s, there was a specific conjuncture that happened, right? Urban planners and engineers had proposed a subway for many decades prior in Santiago, and it never happened. There was never enough money. Inflation was a problem. The conditions of financing were not there. But things came together in the 60s, in part because France was embarking on this very sort of ambitious campaign to export its metro technology all around the world. They were involved in the Montreal Metro, which opened in, I think, 1967, the Mexico City Metro, which opened in 1969, right after the 1968 Olympics, and then Santiago, and then they were also involved elsewhere in Latin America, the Middle East, the places where France had historically had influence. And they offered generous loans, and these were, at the time, the metro systems were not sort of eligible, or they were not really taken into account in terms of loans from like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank. Those organizations funded things that would kind of help in terms of exports, so like ports, highways, also sanitation systems, social projects, but the metro is kind of not really any of those things. So French loans were really important. And at the same time, Charles de Gaulle in the 1960s was sort of projected a bit of independence from the US, which was appealing to modernizing leaders in Latin America, because it was in part because it's, a way of diversifying aid away from the United States. And a way of, it was a source of funding aid for development. And so it's interesting because I see that there's a lot of close collaboration, really good relationships between Chile and France, between those who worked on the metro. At the same time, that relationship was kind of controversial in Chile, partly because they elected to go with a type of rolling stock that at the time was mostly just manufactured in France, but later a little bit in Canada too. This was rubber tire rolling stock. So instead of metal wheels, having rubber tires on the trains. So this was like this French innovation, and it was seen as much more modern than the sort of old style metros with metal wheels. And the proponents of it said it was good because it was a nicer, quieter ride. So this kind of appealed to French being the cutting edge and also to a very comfortable experience. And the critics, and you could also have faster starting and stopping times because of the greater friction with rubber tires. But critics said, look, we're never going to be able to manufacture this in Chile. If we had opted for metal traction, we might have given sort of an opportunity to our own national railroad industry to eventually start manufacturing those trains, but they didn't. Kind of this got them on this track of needing to, French imports, and the trains were imported. And maybe we could show that picture of I have this great photograph by the photographer Luis Ladrón de Guevara. And this is a French train being unloaded at the port in Chile. And I love this image because kind of getting at the cultural representations again of the system. It's like, what does this represent? Is this modernity, development, Chile becoming a first world country, or is it dependent development? This sort of neo-colonial relationship with France, because they have to import the trains. And it's both, I think, because the metro was very popular, even though it also meant state funds, going to France. This benefited the French manufacturing industry. And it also meant a lot of state funds that ended up benefiting middle and upper class neighborhoods because the metro was built into the east, into eastern Santiago, sort of first, and also at the same time that they were building it into the south. So I think that tension there, that image is really interesting. And there's this close collaboration with France, but also controversies and tensions within Chile, within the sort of engineering community about what kind of technology is best. What matters most? Are we trying to benefit? Are we trying to stimulate the national economy, or are we okay with importing trains, which is what they've ended up doing more recently from Spain as well, but that was not until much later. Oh, and I also wanted to briefly mention, because I found it when I was doing this research really interesting, I wanted to know what the impact of the Pinochet's economic reforms was on the metro, because this was a state project, very expensive, and they wanted to cut state spending, austerity in the 1970s and 80s. And I found that the French connection between Chilean engineers and planners and their French advisors and partners served as kind of a buffer to the most radical ideas from the Chicago boys, the Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago, because France saw like the different modes of transit as needing to work together. Sort of they needed to harmonize, they needed to be complementary, and the state needed to take an important role. Whereas other economists saw, the different modes, cars, buses, metro, should compete, but you can't really. Competition didn't work so well in this scenario. So the French role also is sort of a buffer to US ideas about fiscal austerity coming from the Chicago boys.
Thank you, Andra.
Thank you very much, Andra. I will control my time now because I have many ideas. So I don't want to spend more than 7 minutes. If you can share one of the pictures, the second picture I sent you, can help me to respond about this idea of center and periphery, the idea of transnational technologies and the like. The one is black one is a chart, that one. That one. So if you look at Boston and Buenos Aires, who built the subway in each city, you can see, of course, that the Americans have built, Boston was the first subway in the Americas. And they built it with all the American technology, expert, and capital. However, the problem of South American or Latin American countries that we don't have the expert, the capital, the money, nor the technology. So we are always in the position of importing those things. As Andra said, depending from which point of view you look at this, you can say, okay, this is dependency, this is imperialism, this is modernization, national modernization, and the like. So I guess these terms and these ideas of center and peripheries and the transnational perspective, we have to put it in historical context. I guess for the period that Andra looks at, the period I'm looking at today, which is the Latin American metros, national development is an important, development is a keyword. It's not anymore progress, it's development. And there is a strong idea of national development. The Sao Paulo system, the Sao Paulo metro, is an excellent example to see how they planned since the beginning to import technology, but immediately to create national technology. They created the tools to dig the tunnel. They created the rolling stock. They created a lot of laboratories to study science related to engineering, electromechanic, and the like. You can see also that in Mexico. This is not the case for Buenos Aires at the beginning of the 20th century. Buenos Aires is very particular in terms that we have a liberal model in which we believe that a private company had to create the subway. In this sense, because the main company of tramways, which managed the 80% of the tramway sector in Buenos Aires, was the Anglo-Argentine Tramways Company, historians always say, okay, the subway was part of the British capitals and interest in Argentina, who built the railways and also the subway. But if you look into the company, you can see a cosmopolitan company, or if you want to say a multinational company. So these companies in this period are the network, the main network for technologies and knowledge circulation, right? If you look at the period, the post-war, the post-Second War period, or the Cold War period, you will find other agencies, banks, consultancy. Consultancy is a term that you cannot find in the early 20th century, but you can find until today, you know? And the network of power, the geometrics, as Doreen Massey likes to say, the geometry of power relations is completely different after the Second War. You can find clearly, are more visible, the agency, the expert, the international circulation of expert. There are another important term that appears after the Second War, planning. If you look at Chile, Sao Paulo, and Mexico, you will find that the metro is inside an urban plan. It's part of a larger urban plans. It's not the case for Buenos Aires, which is a private company who wants to build up a subway. So I guess this is a very interesting thing, but however, there is another interesting thing, that the first expert who proposed a metro to the municipality of Buenos Aires were the French, and it was expert from Paris Metro. So this presence of expert from Paris Metro is very interesting to dig into the history of this idea of export, knowledge, money, and the like. But if you look at the cosmopolitan origin of the Anglo-Argentine tramway, it was actually a French, German, Belgian company called Sofina. So that explains why the trains, the rolling stock of the first subway, it was Belgian. That's explained why the building company, an important building company like Philipp Holtzmann, was German. And then if you look at the rest of the network in Buenos Aires built up in 1920s and 30s, all the trains, all the technology are from Germany, are Siemens. Even when the company are national or Spanish, the technology is German. So I like to see these hybrid systems of human and non-human to see the components of the system. And you look at there that there are a mix of nationalities. So it's very difficult to say that to look at this in terms of dependency, imperialism, and the like, because there are a lot of negotiations in the middle, in between. There are a lot of the local municipality or the local governments do a lot to put, even when they have to import everything, they regulate and legislate a lot the use of the subsoil, how to build up the subway, and most important, and connecting with the idea of the imaginary of the city, they are very careful about the image of the city. That's why Buenos Aires prefer an underground instead of an elevated. They prefer something like Paris Metro, and they prefer that because two local things. One, it was because it was an underground tramway for urban passengers, urban transport, and it wasn't related with the national railways system. The main discussion in Paris Metro was that between the city and the national government, because the national railways wanted to enter into the city through underground, and the city's council say no. And that was the same case for Buenos Aires. It was 5 years of battle about the control of the city between the national government and the city. And that's why, that explains a lot how the local policies, the politics actually, also shape technologies. I don't like the idea of mobility policies because it's very contemporary. They look at only the globalization period and they don't have an historical perspective. But if you look at any kind of mode of transport, tramway, railways, and the like, you will see that they are transnationals. There is no one country who export for and diffuse the technology to the rest of the world. You can see simultaneity. You can see many cities creating the same technology. If you look at the history of the car, if you look at the history of the tramway, they were created in Europe, they went to America, America developed the technology and went back to Europe. So if you look at the circulation negotiation, that's why I put these arrows above Boston City, because Boston expert went to Europe to look at the models in Europe and went back and decided through a poll, they vote between elevated and subway to create a subway. But if you look at the Anglo-Argentine tramways, you can see the connection with Europe, but also the connection with North America. And historians mostly avoid this perspective. If you look at the metro in Chile and Santiago, the first French metro system was in Montreal, was Canadian. So if you look at the North America connection, it's very important to understand how Europe entered into the Americas. So I guess the geometry is completely different. There are a lot of negotiations in the middle. And at the end of the day, and I guess that's why it's very important, the late Latin American metros, they became local experience and national experience, which are very important. And today, if you look at the international banks, they are not supporting metros. They are supporting cycling path, they are supporting metro bus, BRT systems, but they are not supporting the construction of subways. I think the last loan that Chile had to ask, they did it from Japan, because the International Development Bank didn't want to put money for undergrounds. So it's very expensive technology and not always supported by the international banks for Latin America. And to end, I will say that there are other models in Latin America today, like Colombia. First of all, before was Curitiba model for Latin American cities, and today is Medellin. So we have to be careful. It's not from North America, from Europe, they are from Latin America because they are another power relation today. They say, okay, for you, you have the Metro Cable, the BRT, the cycling path like Medellin. So there are another today map of the power relations.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Well, for the third question, I'd like to, again, to rely on an image. If Mario could share that with us. It's the second slide there. Well, so this is an extremely powerful image that Andra brought to my attention, and it has been haunting me since, and it made me think obsessively about mobility regimes, about mobility and immobility, borders and checkpoints, about the implications of normative principles and surveillance technologies on controlling urban circulation on a daily basis. As you may know, Mimi Scheller phrases this in terms of mobility justice, and I quote her: "The way mobilities are channeled, tracked, controlled, governed, under surveillance, and always unequal." So it would be great if Andra could start giving us the context of the photo and how it relates to your research, Andra. And then Dan could jump in and share his thoughts on the image and to which extent it echoes the mobility regimes that were and are present in Buenos Aires.
Thank you for the, I'm glad. It's a really, you're right, it's a really haunting image, it's really striking. So I'll tell you a little bit about it and kind of how I'm reading it, but it's very much open to interpretation. That's kind of the point of it. So this is by the artist Elias Adasme, Chilean kind of avant-garde artist. And I should also preface this that I'm not an art historian. So this is like, it's really interesting and exciting to me to try to think about the metro in terms of cultural representations, but this is not the one possible reading of it, of course. So the way I see this is the metro in the 1970s, 1980s during the dictatorship, the metro essentially became kind of an icon of the Pinochet regime. The dictatorship used it to showcase, as this was the kind of official rhetoric, right? That this is what could be accomplished under authoritarian regime. The openings, the ceremonies of when they opened line 1 and when they opened line 2, it was not only for a local audience, but also for international observers who were there at the openings to sort of say, in reference to all of the criticism that the regime was receiving in the United Nations for its human rights abuses. This is what needs to happen. Look, here's a metro. This is an obvious example of sort of what can be accomplished. And so artists, everyday residents, activists, then I see it as they began to take the metro as a site, as a sort of entry point into critiquing the regime. And this is one example. So this is it's one panel out of 4. This is actually the artist's body. So he had friends or fellow artists photograph him hanging from the metro, from the sign for, this is Estación Salvador on line 1 of the metro. And then he hung this map of Chile next to him. This is, I think, the second of 4 panels. In each of the panel is a photograph, with his body. One, I think I just want to make sure I'm saying this correctly. In one, he's hanging upside down right next to the map of Chile, but not, in a public space like this one, but in a private space. This is the second one that we see here. In the third one, we see him from behind, again, and completely naked with the map of Chile projected onto his body. And then in the fourth one, he's standing upright, facing the camera, and Chile is written on his body with the map of Chile next to him and with an X through it. And he then took these 4 images and put them onto posters. And he put those posters throughout Santiago. And he wanted to see how long they would stay up before either passersby or the police or the military would take the posters down. They lasted the least amount of time in kind of upper class neighborhoods like Providencia. They lasted, and then in other places like near universities or the city center, I think the longest ones lasted in like a bookshop where the owners of the bookshop would take them down when police or military came by and then put them back up. And then, so the sort of the third kind of iteration of this was then he took these 4 panels and a summary of how long they lasted in the city. And then that became the artwork that was shown, not in Chile, of course, at the time, but in Europe and other places. And then it has been shown in Chile since then, since the return to democracy. But what I think is so interesting, one is this evokes a scene of torture, perhaps. So residents may have thought about that because of the torture and human rights abuses happening in Chile at the time. And of course, the symbolism of hanging on a metro sign, the sort of symbol of development, modernity, but which many people at the time saw as very much a lie because of the lack of political freedom in Chile in the 1970s, 1980s. And of course, Salvador, evoking Salvador Allende, most obviously, but also perhaps the rhetoric that the regime used of saving Chile from, what was described as an impending civil war before the coup. And I also want to mention that the artist, first tried to take this image at a different station, Las Rejas, which means fence, or sort of evoking bars or a prison. But too many people came, and he was afraid of being arrested because it was not legal to take photographs of the metro or its spaces. So then he went to this Estación Salvador, and as the artist recounts, military cadets actually came by while he was taking the photograph, and he became very scared, worrying that he would be arrested. And they paused and they looked at him sort of hanging upside down, wearing jeans. And then one of them just laughed and said, "Dude, it's a jeans commercial." So, which suggests, the kind of consumerism that was taking place in Chile at the time, 1980, but also the many ways that this could be read. And that was a way of protecting himself, in a context of censorship. You can't, traditional images, artistic images of upraised fists that came from the 1960s, like those would have been suicidal. So these kinds of, this kind of symbolism would be able to pass through censorship a bit more. More broadly, I read the metro as a metaphor for the nation, and that this happens throughout the period that I look at, but especially during the dictatorship, because it means so many different things to different people. It was this image of what could be accomplished by an authoritarian regime for the junta and people in power, and for some residents too. Some people just appreciated that it was this clean, safe space, but for other people, it was very heavily militarized. There were a lot of armed guards in the stations in the 1980s, and it was just very uncomfortable, kind of like they didn't like being in that space. Another person described it as a machine of alienation, which I think is just the most evocative thing, because it should have been a legacy of socialism. I mean, it started before Allende's government, but then it continued under Allende, and he was instrumental in making sure that it didn't stop. But then it got inaugurated under Pinochet, and it became the symbol of the regime. So a machine of sort of alienation. And then up to the present day, the metro is very much a powerful site for protests. In late 2019, as I'm sure many of you know, there was a metro fare increase, which sparked massive social mobilizations throughout Chile. And metro stations were some of the most attacked sites. So I think almost every station suffered some sort of damage. Some stations were completely destroyed. Train cars were burned. But of course, the protests and the destruction went beyond the metro, and the demands for change were certainly not limited to the metro, and have now led to a plebiscite on a new constitution in Chile. And so the metro is this, I think, really powerful site to critique power, and also a symbol of these different regimes and of power.
Thank you, Andra. I was thinking, of course, about the last 2 years crisis in Chile, and how the metro was the starting point of that social protest. I think when we study public transport, we are not from social science, we are looking at as a political arena, because it's public space. I think it's the only of the few public space that we have today in Latin America, because if you look at housing, most of rich people go to private neighborhoods. I mean, the privatization of public space is strong in education and the like, but the last, I think, heterogeneous spaces that we have to create some sense of community is public transport or the street, the last one. I mean, that's why I am against the car in terms of the social consequences of the car in our unequal society. So public transport in general is that not only for economic or political problem, but also gender, right? The daily life of women traveling in the public space, you know, being all things related to sexual harassment and the like, racial, you know, not everyone can move in the same way if you're white or black. So, but the underground has some particularities. I guess underground is a very conflictive space because the meaning of the underground, to be under the ground, is the place of death, is the hell, is the catacombs, is something that is not for human. So my first interest in to study the underground was how people can conceive a progress to travel under the city, to go into a tunnel. The tunnel was for sewers, you know, for sanitary works, for the dead and the like. So actually, all the technicians and engineers had to fight against that representation to say, okay, guys, the best and most modern space of the city is under the ground. It's not a skyscraper. It's not the high building. It's not the conquest of the sky. It's the conquest of the subsoil. So these atavistic representations are very strong. So always the underground is in relation to death. Since the beginning, it was an arena for politics arena. For instance, for the anarchists and socialists who put bombs into the underground. But they have an ambivalent meaning also because, of course, the London Underground, for instance, helped to remove the slums in the city center. Okay, so it's part of urban renewal. Always, every engineer, the bridge, roads, and the like, always remove slums or poor people from the city. On the other hand, is a means of transport for the people, not for the aristocratic people, the rich people, are for common people. And it's interesting if you look at all around the world, most of them are conceived for move masses of people. And they have a lot of reformist ideas behind. In Paris, even in London, in Buenos Aires, that was very important. It was called a democratic means of transport. Democratic in terms of massive. And it is very important because in Buenos Aires, the price of the fare remained 10 cents over 5 decades. It was cheaper than the bus. Even, I think it changed 15 years ago. It was cheaper than the bus. So it was completely different if you look at the local context, if you compare with Chile, where Chile is like a European metro, or maybe I don't remember now, Sao Paulo, but if you look at Mexico, Mexico is a very popular means of transport. In Argentina too. And I guess that's why I say it is ambivalent. The regime of the underground could help to reformist, more inclusive, democratic regimes, or can be also because there is some kind of violence in the construction of this infrastructure. It's not only a spatial transformation, but it's very violent. And engineering in general, they love authoritarian governments because they can do whatever they want. So this idea of development, this idea of the public works, and the engineers, they love this idea of no participation from people, nothing like that, you know. Santiago was that experience. There was no participation when they created the Paris system 2 decades ago. So they love, I teach engineering in the school, architect engineer, but they are more like I don't want people opinion, I don't like people, I want to move things, vehicles and the like. So there is a violence there in the knowledge. There is a violence in the disciplining. And also the underground, as you said, Andra, is a space of order. Because the street is congestion, is chaos. The underground is the space of order. There's no, it is a segregation. It's the best way of segregate people from vehicles and the like. So there are many ways of segregation: cycling path, bridges, highways, metro buses, trains. So we need to be careful about this technology because they are technologies of segregations. And also, and the underground in particular is a disciplinary space. They teach people how to travel, how to behave in the underground, much more than the buses and the taxis and the trains, maybe sometimes the trains, but the underground is a space of control always. It's a more controlled space. So that's why it's interesting how this technology is already violent, already disciplinary, and can be reformist too. So I like this ambiguity or ambivalence of the underground because, as Bianca said, it's a problem of politics. It's not a problem of technology. It's a problem of society. So we need to be careful in which kind of society we are looking at, in which period we are looking at the underground.
Oh, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Maybe Mario wants to say a few words to put some questions.
Yes, thank you, Dan, Andra, and Bianca for this wonderful conversation. I'd like to take the opportunity first to invite again our audience to type your questions into the Q&A. And we have a question which refers more to a contemporary context, which I will read out in a minute. I just put my question. I had two questions first because they go back to the, let's say, more historical contexts which you talked about, and I will try to wrap them together. So, as you said in the beginning, when the metros were planned, this was like an initiative or planners imagined metros to bring about suburbanization, relief of congestion. So this already shows us that to some kind social inequality in urban spaces was closely linked to metro planning. I was wondering how has, if you look at the cases you study along the years, could you develop a little bit more about the question of how metros really challenged inequality in the cities you study or reinforced maybe on the other side inequality?
I would be happy to speak to that. This is exactly what I've been thinking about the last few months. I'm revising my book, and the theme of inequality is a lot more present in it now than it was a couple of years ago. I mean, perhaps recent events have kind of helped made me rethink things, but inequality, because concretely, one of the things that I saw is, deciding to build the east-west line first instead of north-south, even though the north-south corridor had higher public transit demand. So I always thought it's the ambivalence that Don mentioned about, is this a democratic space, or is it, there's a lack of democratic process in building it. And I always kind of wanted to see it as this democratic vehicle, but the planning process was not at all democratic. And in the end, it became about relieving congestion, car congestion, more than about primarily serving people who rode public transit. And that was also justified in part because it was cheaper and faster to build it along the east-west corridor, because there was already an existing thoroughfare along the Alameda in Chile. So expropriations were not as big of an issue. So these, those kind of pragmatic choices end up reinforcing inequality. The pragmatism of, we need to do it fast and we need to, not expropriate as much. It will be cheaper. It also ended up serving the sort of eastern neighborhoods sooner. The other thing is that during the dictatorship in the late 70s, there were plans to build Line 3. And for people familiar with Santiago, you might know that Line 3 only opened very, very recently. So it was put on hold for many years. There were plans to build Line 3. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Line 3 ended up not happening, partly due to an earthquake in 1985, but also there were plans to extend Line 2 to the north. And if you remember the map a little bit, there's only a tiny bit of Line 2 up to 1989. And there was actually a swap. Line 2 to the north was scrapped in favor of building Line 1 further east. And that was seen as a logical response because people in the East, in the Eastern Barrio Alto, had the money to ride the metro because it was more expensive. And so it made sense from the perspective of balancing the bottom line. And so inequality kind of comes in many different forms, but a lot of it, from what I see, is this kind of logic of the economic logic of we need to balance the budget, we need to make it cheaper. That ends up meaning like, well, who are our customers? There are people who can afford to ride it in the East. So we need to really make sure that they're riding it so that we have funds coming in. And there was not much of a democratic process for planning it at all that I could see up until the present. Yeah.
Well, I like to put this in a historical context because I guess for the Buenos Aires underground, it was even under an oligarchic regime that ruled Buenos Aires, Argentina between late 19th century until 1916. As Adrian called it, it was a reformist oligarchy regime. In terms that we created public education for everyone. We created a city form, you know, that was homogeneous. We didn't have this typical division of Latin American city between informal and formal city. There was there were a lot of access to housing, as Andra mentioned, in the period when the first underground was created. And most important, the price of the fare. It was very cheap. It was very accessible. So I guess at the beginning it was conceived as an instrument for urbanization, to create urban expansion and to control urban expansion, to improve the public transport access, but also the quality and experience. However, the lack of money of the municipality and the lack of export of municipalities put it in a very dependent situation with the monopoly of the tramway, who created finally the underground and created another kind of network. The municipal network was closer to the Paris Metro. It was a network covering all the neighborhoods, not only going to the center, but also to connect neighborhoods between them. So that was very democratic in terms of layout. However, it was impossible to carry out. And I guess that was the limitation of the municipality. But I want to introduce something here. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, many cities in the world started to discuss about public service. Who is the responsible of public service? The market or the state? And this was called municipalization. There was a tendency of municipal public service. If you look at tramways in London, they were municipal. Boston, it was public and municipal. So there was idea of municipality to take infrastructure and instrument of urban integration, of public goods. And I think with the neoliberal reforms in the 1970s, we lost that idea that infrastructure is a public good. But at the beginning of the 20th century, we can find cities trying to control the public service as a public good. And I think this is a very important thing to think about mobility regimes or urban regimes. We lost that. We lost that. There are a lot, it's more fragmentary today. There is a progressive idea that the underground will bring development, and it's not true. If you look at Latin America, most of the infrastructure are for extractivism, not for the people. If you, Bianca knows very well about Rio de Janeiro. Sometimes narco traffic controls provide infrastructure that the state don't do it. So it's very complex today. But I guess there is here a political discussion about urban infrastructure, which is it is a public good or what. So I think that it's not only about the layout and accessibility, but it's also about the price, the quality of traveling. I mean, people can move fast, but very bad. That happened with all our infrastructure. You have new metro bus in Rio de Janeiro, you have new lines in the underground in Chile, you have a large system in Mexico, but you travel very bad. So it's not, you travel fast, but very bad. So I guess the quality of life is important to see how this infrastructure can improve our daily life.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. This is very interesting, and it directly links to a question which we have from our audience. So Jaime Perez, he says he lived in Santiago from 2007 to 2012, and you were just referring to more current situations. And he comments that he lived through the launch of the Santiago, which at the time was a fairly major disaster. And he asks if the speakers can comment on what is the balance from your point of view of the Santiago today as compared to the previous system or lack thereof. And he says also that he would be happy afterwards to speak to you and tell or change ideas about that. Maybe Andra, you want to go first as you're the expert on Santiago?
Yeah, it's not as much the focus of my, like, I'm not in it as much in terms of my research, but from what I know, it was an improvement, you know, and it was, the previous system was pretty chaotic. The bus gremios, the professional bus associations, had a lot of political power and were very hard to regulate. And as a result, there was, you know, kind of how engineers described it, there was a lot of inefficiency. You know, buses were generally not very crowded, which was good. That kind of solved an earlier challenge, but they crowded the streets. So the streets were very congested. There were a lot of accidents. There was a lot of air pollution. And so Santiago helped by kind of restructuring the whole bus system and making sure that they fed into the metro lines. So the metro use rose, it essentially doubled overnight in 2007, which brought tremendous shocks to the system. And passengers and metro workers suffered a lot. And that kind of gets at the next question here that's in the Q&A from Claudia. But so in that sense, it was a huge challenge, and still people, you know, it was a disaster in terms of how it was implemented. But from the perspective of, I think, the planners, they eventually got what they wanted in terms of reorganizing the city. And also from the metro agency's perspective, it actually has been good. You know, there's a lot more people using it, and it means that the metro is an essential part of, it's an essential infrastructure in a way that it wasn't before Santiago. I don't know if that answers your questions.
Yeah, maybe if Dan doesn't want to comment on this, we can pick up Claudia's question. And yeah, she says that she thanks you for your interesting talks and talking about the metros as technology of segregation or democratization. What role do the workers who work on the metro, either as construction workers or as train conductors, play in your research, your projects? How would they fit into your narratives also with regards to labor unions or labor protests?
Thanks for that question. Workers are really important in my project. And they come and go depending on kind of the source base, but I did interviews with metro workers from the 1970s, 1980s, and really up to the present. And it's harder to get the perspective of construction workers because they're much more transient in terms of, you know, sources, and the people I interviewed were able to work at the metro for a long period of time, and then I could find them now through going to the unions that exist today. But interestingly, so employment and the idea of increasing employment was always kind of part of the argument for building a metro, and it did employ a lot of people. And right after the military coup in 1973, the first recorded instance of a labor stoppage happened at the metro, I think in like 2 months after the coup, if that's right, or maybe 1 month after. And I only know about it because of the French archival documents that exist. Like the French kind of head of the metro project wrote about how I think it was hundreds of workers, called a work stoppage because of serious problems in labor conditions, low wages, serious demands about working overtime. And so that in itself is really interesting to me. But then also there were efforts to unionize, but unions were illegal because they were public workers in the 1970s, 1980s. So there were efforts to unionize, and the leaders of that were fired. And the Metro was seen as this kind of space of high status in a way, kind of like they were kind of privileged, labor group, because the Metro was it was a stable source of employment at a time of great economic precarity in the 70s and 80s. And there was opportunity for advancement. And, because of this, it was like very fancy, innovative technology. So the idea that you worked for the Metro kind of gave you status just in terms of social life. People said, oh, I got noticed at parties, or I got thicker slices of cheese from the shopkeepers because I worked for the Metro. Or I could take out loans. The pay wasn't great, but it was stable. I could take out loans because my check would always come on time. And more recently, the Metro's expansion and kind of quote unquote success since the 90s and into the 2000s has really been kind of on the backs of workers and passengers, because the Metro has had to increase revenue. And so they do it by raising fares and finding ways to cut costs. A lot of workers are outsourced now. And the Metro was converted to a state corporation in 1990, which made it easier to subcontract labor. And I don't know as much about this, but for private capital to participate in some aspects of the Metro that weren't possible before it was a state corporation. So yeah, and there's a lot of segregation among the labor force then between subcontracted workers and those who are full-time. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the question. I guess there is two aspects here. It's not the same, the people who work in the construction of the tunnel and the people who operate the subway. I guess, and I will talk about my period of analysis, late 19th century, early 20th century. Most of these works, constructions, have death. Lots of people die digging the tunnel. And that was seen as the victims of progress. It was necessary that people die to build up this. And in America, you have a lot of examples, not only for underground, but also with bridges, skyscraper, and the like. Boston had a gas explosion where many people die. New York also, and it was part of this violence I was talking about this infrastructure. The idea of it can change the nature of the city or the subsoil. We can change the planet, and we can change also humanity in terms of destroy. So I guess that there is some kind of violence there, where always this work were precarious, always work with immigrants mostly, very bad paid. But sometimes the narratives that you can find in documents, in records, are about, yes, we are doing this sacrifice for the nation, for the city, and the modernity, blah, blah, blah. So I guess you have there a group of workers. Then the workers of the underground, as Andra said, have certain status. Because it's a new technology, it requires a lot of skills, and there are hierarchies, strong hierarchies. There are the underground workers said people who work underground and people who work on the tower control tower, on the ground. So there are important separations and segregation between the workers. And that's, in my case, the workers of tramway workers in general in Buenos Aires was socialists and anarchists at the beginning. And then after the 1950s, they became very, very conservative. In the last 3 decades, when the system, there was a privatization of the underground system, the working union helped a lot to the bad condition of workers to the company who managed the subway. And it was creating a new labor union, which is more from left workers, Trotskyists and other left tendencies, and also with a strong participation of women. Today we have women as a guards, as a motor woman, not only, you know, selling the tickets. So I guess today the underground in Buenos Aires became an interesting political arena of new ways of working labor. That means that it's more democratic for passenger. Well, I guess, I mean, subway workers have to control people. I mean, this is always is the enemy, you know, the guard, the guy who controls your behaviors in the circulation in the underground. So there are always conflict there. Even when most of the strikes of the worker was to open the gates of the metro so you can travel for free. Most of people in the city of Buenos Aires are very conservative. They vote for a conservative party since 2007, and they support the government and the company instead of the workers, even when the workers open the gate. So it's a political arena. I guess there is not a direct or linear relationship between workers and guards and passengers. So that's the case, for instance, for Buenos Aires. But if you look at London today, the main strikes in London Underground are because the automatization of the underground. And I think this is the key conflict in the underground. Today, trains can move by themselves without no motorman. You can see in France, this is another French technology. And this is very important for the company because they don't want to have people moving the things. Things can move by themselves through technologies. And I think this is the key theme, you know, the key question within underground workers. In New York, the labor workers are very, very strong. In Boston is very weak, but in New York is very strong, and they stop a lot of automatization of the system. So there is here again, we have this idea of traditional worker against modernization of technology conflict, which is very, very old.
Thank you, Dan, for this insightful comment. Yeah, I would like to invite my colleague, Albert Manke, to raise his question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mario. I tried to put it in the Q&A, but I don't know, somehow the organizers can't do it, as I just found out. So yeah, thank you so much for your really, really insightful and interesting presentations. I have a question for Andra. How about if you could tell us a bit more about the role of forced labor in these infrastructure projects? Maybe by detainees of the Pinochet regime and possible international cooperation in the Cono Sur that might have happened, I don't know it, parallel to Operation Condor. I'm just a bit familiar with the case of Paraguay, but I don't know about Chile.
Oh, I'm sorry, I realized I wasn't muted. I should have been. Thanks for the question. I don't have a lot of great answers for it, but I mean, I know that, you know, labor protections were, you know, stripped away after the coup. You know, former union leaders were arrested. The situation was really dire. It was illegal to, you know, parties were abolished, but also it was not possible to vote for unions or for unions to exist. So there was that kind of general repressive context. There's also, you know, accounts of people working for free or having to work for free on weekends and holidays to get the project up and running faster. I haven't seen any sources about actual, like kind of what you're talking about, I think, the forced labor, beyond the more general context that there were very few labor protections at the time. The other thing that I guess kind of gets at your question is there are some accounts and also rumors, but it's hard to prove them, but I think the fact that they exist is important, that bodies of people killed after the coup were thrown in the metro excavation pits. I interviewed one woman who she lived in an area near where they're doing the excavations on the Alameda. And so she saw like a military convoy with legs, you know, sticking out and going to the Alameda and then returning empty. And this was when there was a curfew, so no one could be on the streets. No one would have seen it happen. And there were also people who sort of said, oh, I heard that this had been happening. The other thing is that in terms of French connections with Latin America, there was a lot of transfer of sort of counterinsurgency techniques to Brazil during the dictatorship, to Argentina, and so there's some to Chile too, partly through Brazil, military, intelligence officials going to Brazil and learning. So techniques like torture and disappearance actually coming from the Algerian War and from France more than, and then the US learning from the French. And also from what I gathered, there was some, even though France was officially kind of critical of the regime, yeah, there was evidence of the intelligence communities cooperating, which is, sort of paralleling Operation Condor.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was just looking it up again in my sources, and I talked to people that have been interned in the concentration camp in Emboscada in Paraguay that were, working to pave all the streets in Asunción elsewhere. But yeah, I was just wondering if this also could have taken.
May have been. I haven't dug into that line of inquiry in of itself, but that's really. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Andra. We have one more question, and I think time is coming to an end, so I will take this as the last question, which is from our colleague here at the GHI, Caroline Liebisch, and she asks, in how far would you say that metros also have become, against their intended purpose, subversive social sites, especially for socioeconomically or politically marginalized groups? Thinking, for example, of illicit underground activities, graffiti culture, homeless people staying in the metro, etc. Does this play any role in your research?
Do you want to speak to that at all, Dan?
Okay, as I said, I guess at least in my period, and always in the second period after the Second War, this idea of massivity or moved masses is always in the project of underground. It's not an underground for a few people. The question is if I move a lot of people under the ground, then the street is for whom? I guess this is always you must see the modes of transport in a relational way. Because if you liberate the street from congestion, for whom? Who move in the street? The car. So I guess sometimes the underground is subsidiary of the car. The underground move workers, and then rich people can move freely on the streets in cars. So I guess this is one of the questions that I always try to look at. I guess the idea of to have a clean order and a street for automobiles. And this is the underground helps a lot to that project. Even when the guy who created the underground in each city could be democratic, progressive, whatever, they say this is for the people. Okay, but people, why they have to do under the ground in very bad conditions and with the pandemics? Look at the pandemics. It's a play for infection. So we need a street for people, not for cars. And I guess we need to be careful because what you can see in Bogota with the Metro Bus, which is a democratic, massive transport for people, it still is an automobile regime. Bianca asked about what is the regime of the city. Still we have automobile regimes. Even with more and more underground, more metro buses, more metro cable, the city are for the cars, still today. And the car in Latin America is for rich people or high middle class.
I would say that the metro has not really been a subversive site, at least not until maybe in more recent years in Santiago. Instead, it was really this space of order. You know, it was very much controlled. And so it's not, you know, that's not how it is in other places, you know, New York City or, and so there was a lot of strict controls, you know, against street illicit vendors, graffiti. I think that I'm not sure when that started to change in Santiago. It is different now, and I haven't been able to get down there with the pandemic. You know, I think it's maybe started to change after Santiago in 2007. But for this main period that I study, it's, you know, those kind of subversive activities that you mentioned don't occur in the metro. And there's actually, interestingly, in the 90s, the Democratic Concertación governments, they wanted to make the metro seem a bit more humane, more democratic, more welcoming. So they sponsored these major sort of arts initiatives. Actually, I don't know how much money they put into it because it was a partnership with banks. So the banks would fund the art, you know, and they would get tax write-offs. But they made the metro seem like these, you know, you would get, it also was added value, right? So they could charge more because they had wonderful art in the metro stations. But there were a lot of rules against, you know, just anyone coming and busking. Couldn't do that. There were musical performances, but they had to be licensed and arranged by the Metro Corporation. So really different experience than, you know, riding the New York subway or the train in New York for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Andra. And unfortunately, we have to close this session. It is so great. I want to thank all the three of you for the great conversation we had today, especially Andra and Dan for giving us insights into your very exciting research, and also Bianca for moderating this session. Yeah, and I would also like to thank the audience for joining us today and those who have contributed to our discussion with questions. A big thank you also to Josh Seal, who has been running this event in the background. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us for our next session on April 30. And the topic then will be Flying Down to Rio, Aviation, National Images, and Hemispheric Relations in the Americas. And we will have three speakers: Leonie Schuster from Kiel University, Melina Piglia from the National University of Mar del Plata, Argentina, and Peter Solon from the Southeast Missouri State University. And the session will be moderated by Stefan Rinke, Professor of Latin American History at the Freie Universität Berlin. Once again, thanks for joining. Have a great day, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you, Mario. Bye-bye to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone, for the attendees and the organizers.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.